Hi, welcome to the Sankofa Pan African series. Our guest today is someone that I admire a lot. I consider her a living legend. Curious to meet her? Please click on your subscription button if you haven't done so. And also, don't forget to turn on your notification button. Thank you. Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard is a social worker, educator, researcher, community activist, and advocate for social change. Since 1990, she has worked as a professor at the Dalhousie School of Social Work, where she also served as director for a decade. She is the first African Nova Scotian to hold a tenure track position at Dalhousie University, and also the first to be promoted to full professor. She's a founding member of the Association of Black Social Workers, which helps address the needs of marginalized citizens, especially those of African descent, here in Canada. At the national level, she has served as a member of the National Coalition of Advisory Councils on the Status of Women. She has also served as an expert witness in human rights cases. Dr. Thomas Bernard has been honored with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Award, the Order of Canada, and the Order of Nova Scotia, among others. In 2016, she became the first female African Nova Scotian to be appointed to the Canadian Senate. On a personal note, I have had the privilege of working on a couple of projects with Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. I'm a great admirer of her work towards insisting that the struggle against racism must move from the margins and be placed right in the center. Welcome, Wanda. Thank you very much for being a part of this, Dr. Um, Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. Um, yeah. On May 1st, 2018, you stood in the Canadian Senate and introduced an inquiry into anti-Black racism. What has been the outcome of that call?
Well, that's very interesting that you're leading off with that question. I would say that that inquiry went quite well. I had a number of colleagues from across the Senate chamber who spoke to the inquiry, a number who spoke to different aspects of the inquiry. So looking at anti-Black racism, systemic racism in prisons, in the education system, in health and healthcare system, in the justice system. So people looked across many different spectrums. People also spoke to it from the perspective of white privilege, white male privilege, and trying to understand what it means. From the inquiry, I actually launched the Emancipation Day Bill, Bill 255. And unfortunately, when that Senate, when we rose, anything that wasn't passed at that time, when a Senate session stops, then everything falls off the order paper. And so it fell off the order paper, so nothing happened. Nothing happened. And so by this time, we're into 2019. Those two initiatives were forced to end because of that parliamentary session ending. When we returned, it took some time to get things up and going again after the 2019 election. And of course, it's a minority government that we have now. I made a decision to ask my colleagues in the House of Commons to bring forth a motion on Emancipation Day. That motion now has had its first series of votes. It's called Motion 36. An MP from Markham, Ontario, Majid Jahari, he's the person leading that motion. He's taken up the call to have Emancipation Day recognized nationally. I'm hoping that that motion comes to a final vote before the end of this parliamentary session. But there's no way of knowing. And in the intervening time, of course, COVID happened. And with COVID, not so much of the attention of parliamentarians has been on dealing with the pandemic of COVID, both the health crisis and also the economic crisis that's impacting the whole world and certainly impacting us here in Canada. So that's sort of what happened since that motion was introduced on May 1st, 2018. It actually feels a bit like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, but a lot has happened since then.
A lot has happened. But an interesting thing that happened was through the pandemic of COVID, we also saw the pandemic of racism become much more visible around the world. When George Floyd was killed by a police officer, and a young woman, a young African-American woman, filmed it and put it up on social media for the world to see. I like to call her name Darnella Frazier. The fact that happened, suddenly the rest of the country woke up, including, the Senate of Canada. There was an emergency debate on systemic racism, and some people spoke to that debate as though it was the first time it ever happened in the Senate. It was like it was the first time there was a discussion in the Senate about racism, and that certainly is not the case. So I like to remind people that certainly, to my knowledge, African Canadians and certainly African Nova Scotians that preceded me in the Senate have been talking about issues of racism in the Senate and trying to move forward. The fact that we're marking 25 years of the government of Canada acknowledging Black History Month during the month of February. Honorable Jean Augustine brought forward that motion, over 25 years ago. And a few years later, Senator Oliver brought forth the motion in the Senate, again, that we would celebrate Black History Month.
So this Emancipation Day bill motion is for us to now have a national day of celebrating emancipation. Or what?
A national day of recognition that emancipation happened, which would trigger Canadians to understand that slavery existed in Canada. And through that, we should be able to tell a more complete history of Canada's relations and relationships with people of African descent. We should be able to tell a more complete history of the contributions of African people to building Canada.
Yeah.
And other than the Indigenous peoples, people of African descent, have been here for a long, long time and have helped to build this nation. And it's important for us to recognize that although slavery was abolished on August 1st, 1834, anti-Black racism wasn't. abolished.
Yeah, yeah. I took a
And
class on segregation yesterday, and the young people I was talking to were amazed, at the history that has been left out of the school curriculum.
yes,
They didn't even
yes,
know about Africville.
yes,
They didn't know that segregated schools existed,
yes.
in Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec, and the other places. And they were just like, they didn't know. They didn't know about
They
segregation.
didn't know.
They didn't know.
And I like to remind people that I actually went to a segregated school.
Mm.
My first school was a segregated school. I went to a segregated school up until grade 7. Schools were legally segregated
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Nova Scotia, and you lived in Nova
yes.
Scotia, and you know that we also have geographic segregation.
Segregation, yes.
So although legal segregation ended, we still had and still have.
We still have it.
We still have de facto segregation because of the ways in which the communities are geographically segregated.
Yes.
They're geographically marginalized.
Yes.
They're geographically stereotyped.
Yes.
They're geographically impacted by systemic anti-Black racism, which means that there has not been the development. Those communities haven't been developed.
Yes.
And because they're on the fringes of white towns and white cities, they've been systematically cut off from services that people take for granted, services like water and sewer. And I think about, I know you've been to the Prestons, East Preston, North Preston. And when I think when I think about Lake Major servicing the Dartmouth water supply, and then people in North Preston only got water and sewer after that Maclean's article shamed our province into it. And in East Preston, where I live, I moved back to East Preston,
Yeah, I know. I remember when you were working.
Okay. So in East Preston, we still don't have water and sewer in our communities.
No.
And I think about environmental racism. I think about the numbers of people in whole family groups impacted by cancer. And you have to wonder, I pause sometimes and I think, is this because of pollution?
In fact, your comment now is preempting my next question.
Okay.
I know a lot of your work as a social worker, professor, activist, and now senator have been about fighting racism and identifying ways to end systemic racism. Some of our viewers out there might not quite know what systemic racism is. What is systemic racism? How is it different from individual racism?
Individual racism is that racism that you can see, that's direct, that's specifically targeted at an individual. It could be name calling, it could be racial profiling that happens on a one-on-one basis. Systemic racism is racism that's deeply embedded into all of our systems, our laws, our government, our institutions. Some people, sometimes we use the word institutional racism. Sometimes we use systemic. It's the creation and fulfillment of barriers that privilege some groups while systematically excluding others. So if we think about systemic anti-Black racism, that's embedded in our history. That history of one narrative that says Canada was so much better than the United States that the poor Black people escaped slavery and came to Canada, and we were so good to our Negroes, quote unquote, that we allowed them, to come to Canada. So that message of the Underground Railroad, that message that paints Canada in such a positive light, that sort of lays the groundwork for how we should even be seeing ourselves in relation to the rest of the country. And that story leaves out
Yes.
the systemic ways in which, first of all, that slavery also happened. Secondly, looking at what happened with the Black Loyalists, for example.
Yes.
All of the loyalists who fought for the British were promised land in Canada, in
the worst land, in the hope that they die out, maybe.
We were never meant to survive. We were never meant to survive. So that's part of how systemic racism operates. It's at a level that you can't see.
And its effects are so broad, everywhere.
Yes, everywhere, every institution. You can't escape it. It's in absolutely every institution that we have, and so difficult for people to wrap their heads around it.
Yes.
Because on the surface, it looks like everything is fine.
So how do we tackle it?
We tackle it, first of all, by naming it. And if we have leaders who say that systemic racism doesn't exist, then we're not going to be able to tackle it. Because how can you tackle something that you don't believe exists? So we first of all, we need people who are in positions of power, influence, and leadership. We need them to acknowledge that this is reality, that we're not making it up, that we're not lazy.
I know. Or we're not lacking in intellect or ability, mental ability.
Yes. Yeah. So that's the message. That's the message that's continually sent to us. That if we just all do better, if we all just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. I remember, if you look at my bio, I've been a first in far too many things. And that's not something that I celebrate. If my ancestors have been in the country since the 1800s, I shouldn't be the first in anything. It's an insult. It's an insult to my ancestors, and it's also a signal. It's a signal to the country that systemic racism has held people back. And we can see how things are strung together, right? Education impacts employment and employability. Employment and employability impact where you live and how you live. Your access to things like health and post-secondary education, and even your access to the justice system is impacted. We have finally managed to convince Health Canada to include racism as a social determinant of health.
It is.
Yes, and having that recognized by Health Canada, having that included on the list, I think is an important piece.
It is.
And again, it's also a way of signaling the systemic nature of racism.
Again, this brings me to my next question. Wanda, I had the opportunity of observing some of your work that focus on racism and health of African Nova Scotians. Can you please share some of your findings from the project On the Margins? Because I know that was something that you put a lot of energy and effort into.
Black Women on the Margins is a research project which was exploring Black women's health related issues and access to health care in Southwest Nova, from Liverpool to Annapolis County. The project took place from 2003 to 2006, and we recently had a conference in Yarmouth called Black Women on the Margins, From Research to Action.
Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard is the principal investigator. She stated that when the project began, a major challenge was the absence of documented information on the health status of African Nova Scotians.
This actually made the research very important and very significant, and especially when you think about this project being done in rural Nova Scotia. That project, Black Women on the Margins, was a seminal piece of work looking specifically at women of African descent on the southwest Nova shore in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
So for people who won't know, sort of from Bridgewater, Shelburne, Yarmouth, Digby, Weymouth,
I remember
that whole.
We came and shot in Yarmouth.
Yes.
Some of your work in Yarmouth. Yeah.
And we hired women from the community. So community members were hired to work on this project with us. Mm. We set out to do about 50 interviews with women.
Yes.
We ended up with about 270 because women were lining up to be interviewed.
Yeah.
Because we had community-based interviewers, they were identifying people to interview, and then those people were telling other people, and the next thing we know, we have all this data. and the data sort of looking at Black women's health and access to health.
The findings are quite alarming. Of the 237 women interviewed, 48% were struggling with high blood pressure. 35% had high cholesterol, and 28% were diabetic.
And a thread that was woven throughout that was really about the different layers of racism. So the cultural racism, the individual racism, but also the institutionalized and systemic racism really came out there. And then the findings, the women themselves had great ideas for how we should profile the findings.
Yes.
So one of the researchers, Louise Delisle, she wrote a play. I think the title of it was "Who Will Care for Aunt Ethel?"
Yes.
and the message there was Aunt Ethel was looking after everybody, taking care of everybody, and putting her own health in jeopardy in the process. And Aunt Ethel died.
Yeah.
And that's one of the messages about strong Black women.
Yeah.
I remember someone
wrong ideas that we're raised with, that because just because you're Black, you're so strong enough to take all that is thrown at you, and at the end of the day, by 6 o'clock, you're dead.
Yes, and as Black women, and one of the things that film really highlighted for us was that as Black women, there's this expectation. I mean, we do live in a patriarchal society, and this expectation of women as caregivers and Black women as caregivers is not just caring for your own family. It's really caring for everyone. So you're caring for your neighborhood. You're caring for your extended family. You're caring for kinship family.
Yes.
I remember one of the stories I remember is this woman who left Halifax to go back to one of those communities to take care of a woman that had taken care of her, who was no blood relation to her.
A communal mother.
Yes. Absolutely astounding. Then one of the other things that happened in that project, a research assistant named Gail decided that there should be a quilt made. Yes. Gail worked with women in the community, and they created this fantastic quilt. And each block on the quilt was a theme from one of the women's stories, from a theme from the research, a theme from the stories about Black women's health. And she also managed to go, I think there were nine local municipalities in the area of the research. She went to each of those municipal units and invited them to participate in the project by sponsoring. And each of those units gave some funding. And in return, the quilt hung in each of those municipal units for a week.
Awesome.
And then we had to decide what to do with the quilt. You know, do you choose one of those 9 communities,
Yeah.
or do you choose a neutral place?
Yeah.
We chose a neutral place, and the quilt is hanging in the lobby of the School of Social Work at Dalhousie.
Oh, nice. Awesome.
And so I consider it one of my legacy gifts to the school.
This discussion will be continued in the next episode. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the Sankofa Pan-African series channel. Like our videos and please share them with your contacts.